Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar organized by the Secretariat of the EU Platform for Coal Regions in Transition under the title Environmental Rehabilitation and Repurposing. My name is Andrzej Błachowicz. I'm one of the senior advisors at the Platform Secretariat. I work for Climate Strategies, which is a member of the consortium operating that secretariat along with 3 other organizations. It is the second in a series of 3 webinars. The first one we organized on the 25th of May on transition strategies and governance of transition. So some of you, I'm sure, attended that one as well. The third one will be held later in June on sustainable employment and welfare support. And more webinars can come as we develop more toolkits. If you could move now, Martin, to the agenda. Yes, so here is our game plan for today. We decided to offer you 3 speakers: a policymaker, and an analyst, and a practitioner. So we always, in the platform, we try to bring different perspectives to the discussion. So we will start with introductory remarks by repurposing from DG Energy of the European Commission, who is the patron of the platform. Brio has been working on the coal regions for a couple of years. At the same time, he's also in charge of Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. I have to say, I don't know how he manages to stay abreast of those 2 portfolios, but he does it very well. Brio will put today's conversation in a context, will tell you why we chose this subject for the toolkit and the corresponding webinar, how it fits within the Just Transition chapter of the European Green Deal, and also tell us a bit about the EU financial support. Then we move to the presentation of the toolkit and the subject of environmental rehabilitation and repurposing. And that will be delivered by my colleague, Timon Venert, who is also the senior advisor at the Secretariat. And Timon works for Wuppertal Institute, another consortium partner of the consortium running the Secretariat. And Wuppertal was specifically institutionally in charge of the toolkits. And I must really say that they did a titanic and good job in putting those toolkits together, especially in integrating very often contradictory comments by various groups of stakeholders. So thank you for that. And finally, the practitioner, and we have the pleasure of having Mr. Wolf Paul from the World Bank. He is currently based in Thailand, where he works as regional safeguards coordinator, covering countries such as China, Kiribati, Myanmar, and Mongolia. But let me assure you that he is going to present a tool that is actually being now applied in Europe, namely in Western Macedonia and potentially also in Ukraine. I love this sentence in Wolf's bio, which says that he specializes in large, complex, and high-risk projects in pollution management, mine closure, and land remediation, and geohazards management. So I can't think of a better person for this subject. Wolf also reviewed the toolkit, and his intervention will be about effective post-mining lands repurposing. So those 3 interventions and my introduction should ideally take 40 minutes. I think because we started late, for which I apologize, I think we probably should just give ourselves 5 or 7 minutes grace period so that we can really do the full hour. But our plan is to leave 20 minutes for questions. So if we can now move to the structure slide. So you see this is the webinar structure, 1 hour, which is not a long time, but we feel this is appropriate in the time that many of us are on hundreds of video calls every week. Participants are muted, so this is important. So and you are also not sort of visible. Your video is not shown. Questions, and this is really important. You can see the questions panel in your GoToWebinar software. So this is the place where you should type in your questions, and they will be answered in those 20 minutes. We'll try to group them as much as possible. Those questions that won't be answered, we'll try to answer them later and send you the responses. One important feature is that the questions are only visible to the organizers. This is something that we may discuss for the webinars to come, but this is what we decided to do for this webinar as well. So only the organizers can see the questions. Finally, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the DG Energy YouTube channel. You simply type in any search engine DG Energy YouTube, and it comes up, and it's the first item. I mean, the first item now is the webinar from the 25th of May, and this will be, I guess, on top of the list after we are done. If we can move, yes. So this is basically finally moving to the very topic. I just want to say that it's not the first time that the platform is dealing with the subject. We organized 3 breakout sessions on the subject in the physical platform meetings in Brussels. In July and October, we hosted a session called Coal Mine Closure Companies and Authorities and Their Role in Transition, where we presented a bunch of case studies and trying to get to the bottom of the institutional barriers in implementing the rehabilitation measures. And then in addition, in October, we also held a session specifically on coal plant repurposing. You may refer to video streams of those sessions as well as reference documents that we publish after each platform meeting on the DG Energy website. Simply type in DG Energy coal regions and you can find it there. I think the following speakers will prove that the subject is important. I think this is quite self-explanatory why it is important for our discussions about coal regions and their transition. But I just want to emphasize the repurposing part, which is really this part that we think, if properly implemented, can really catapult the regions into the sustainable future. We are trying to prove that with the toolkit, and I'm sure Brew will tell you that the Commission is trying to prove that this is possible with all the measures that they were recently announced as part of the Green Deal. And the very last remark is that the aspects we are covering here are the aspects of governance, finance, tools, and approaches, and not the technical aspects of the issue. Those are dealt by other reports and other projects, including a Horizon 2020 project called Tracer. So you may consult their website if you are more interested into the technical aspects. Okay, I think then without further ado, I am passing the floor to Brew.
Thank you, Andrzej. Can you hear me? Is it working? Super. Thanks a lot then, and hello everyone. Thanks, Andrzej, for the introduction. I think I'm very happy to see that so many of you have took the time to make yourself available for this very important webinar. I know some of you are juggling between professional and personal obligations. Others are already back in the office, as you can see from the background behind me. This is not the case for people working in Belgium. We're still working from home, so I apologize for the kitchen decor, but that's where the Wi-Fi is strongest in the house. So just to introduce very briefly the purpose of this webinar and a bit the reasoning behind the toolkit on environmental rehabilitation and repurposing. This is one of the first toolkits that we decided to ask the Secretariat to prepare, because this is one of the first questions that comes when a mine closes. How do we put the land back into its natural state? Who does it? Who pays for it? So there's a number of questions that arise from that specific issue. And as Andrzej reminded, it's also a topic that we touched upon quite significantly during platform meetings. But I think, one of the first thing that we realized by listening to practitioners, by looking at best practices in Europe and the world, was that the question was not just how to put the land back in its natural state, but also what to do with it, what to do with this land, what to do with this asset that is just standing there and on which you have to depollute, but then you have to do something with it. And that's where the reference to repurposing comes from. So the idea, of course, in having these two terms put together is not that we downplay the environmental rehabilitation, not at all. This is a legal requirement. This still has to be done. But by integrating the idea of repurposing very early on in the planning phase, you can actually save time and money and achieve better results faster. So that's a bit the reasoning between the link between the two terms and the reason why we wanted to present them jointly. So if we can go now to the next slide, I'll let the experts introduce the topic of repurposing and of environmental rehabilitation itself. I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but I just wanted to say a few words on how this plays within the EU context. In the long term and in the more recent developments, rehabilitating mining sites has been a matter of interest of the EU for a long time now. It's not something new. The EU has been providing support to closing coal mines for this particular purpose for years. This is not something new. One thing that is very clear in EU law, one principle that is key, is the polluter pays principle. So it means that a company or a government that is responsible for environmental damage has to be the one that pays for repairing them. So in the case of coal mining, however, it appears that often the responsibilities are a bit blurred because of the history behind coal mining, because of the ownership structures of coal mining companies, and also often because of the bankruptcy procedures that are happening when the mine closes. So it's a bit more complicated in the case of coal mining. And this is the reason why, while the polluter pays principle still apply, of course, in practice, the EU also provides public support to help rehabilitate former coal mines and depollute them. So there are a number of tools. I'll just mention them very briefly. One of them is, of course, some flexibility on state aid. So there is a council decision that allows member states to provide aid to coal mining company to cover these costs of environmental rehabilitation. This is not considered as illegal state aid because of this common interest perspective. We also have some EU funds that are providing direct support to such activities. So the most obvious example is LIFE, where we have multiple examples across the EU of LIFE being used to rehabilitate former brownfields or mining sites. And last thing I'd like to mention is something more recent with the European Green Deal and its corresponding just transition mechanism. We have put the environmental rehabilitation of former mining sites as one of the key eligible expenses under the Just Transition Fund. So this is really where regions will start from when they will begin their transition. This environmental rehabilitation, it lays the ground for the future developments that the region will go through. It also provides temporary employment to people that are employed in the coal mining companies. So there's a number of reasons for that, just for you to know that this is really an important area and that will also benefit from support under the Just Transition Fund. So I won't be much longer than that. I think I just wanted to introduce these topics. Then I'll remain available after the interventions of the other experts in case you have specific questions. I just wanted to pinpoint the fact that we will have an event towards the end of this month, the Coal Regions Virtual Week, where we will really delve into the topic of financing of the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism, just so that it doesn't overshadow this particular meeting. So it will be from the 29th of June to the 3rd of July. We'll have a lot of time then to really address these questions. So if you haven't received an invitation for that, contact us. But in any case, I think for today's purpose, let's try to focus the questions maybe on the more technical aspects. And if you have anything specific, I'll be happy to answer. So Andrzej, I'm done. So I'll hand the floor back to you then.
Super, Brio, thank you so much, and great to have you with us. And yeah, I'm sure we can, and that's what I will say, at the end, that we really would like all of you on this call and also in the sort of platform community to stay in touch with us, not only via the events, but just in between, especially in those times. Thanks very much, Brio. And I think now over to Timon. Timon, please guide us through the toolkit and the subject, and hopefully that will trigger interesting questions. Timon.
Yeah, thank you, Andre, for the introduction, and Brio, and thank you for all of you joining. I mean, I just flipped through the list of attendees. We have now 90 people participating, which is a great number, and unfortunately you can't see the names, but from the look of the names, it seems we're spread around all across Europe participating, and it's sad that we can't meet and see each other, but at least we take this opportunity to discuss the topics that are really on our hearts and minds. As Brio said, the toolkit on environmental rehabilitation and repurposing, there is the technical term environmental rehabilitation in it, but it is really very much about the future and developing the future of the regions also in an economic sense, because that is the basis. It's the question of, is there something hidden in the ground? Is there old cost liabilities, or is it a land that can be used for other industries, for agriculture, for tourism? And this is what the toolkit addresses. As Andre already pointed out, we did not touch the very technical questions of how do you really do water management, how do you do soil rehabilitation, things like that. There are other existing guidelines and handbooks that cover that, and it's a general approach we take in all of the toolkits that we reference to other existing guidelines. And if you're interested, then please have a look, and we reference you further, but it's not really a focus of this toolkit. Instead, we look very much at the governance. How do you govern that process of rehabilitation and repurposing? What kind of institutions do you need? And one issue is securing finance. And Brio also mentioned that the polluter pays principle is there in the EU, and there are rules for liabilities, but there is some touchy issues that definitely need to be addressed. And another thing that we see is it's a very complex issue, and there is a need for knowledge and tools, and we reference to some existing tools which are, I think, very helpful for practitioners. Next slide, please. Maybe some key messages. As I've said, when we think of environmental rehabilitation, we immediately think of protecting citizen health, safety, environment, nature. But I think it's very much really of how do we attract new businesses to regions? And it's not only a question of land and landfill sites, coal mining areas, but it's often also a question of other infrastructure that sits on coal mines or close to coal mines, and also related to industry that has settled around coal mines, for example, steel industry. And when coal mines close down, the question is, how can we use that infrastructure very quickly? And we have also developed some case studies, and they range from regions where now mines are active now, and it is just a question of what is a cost-efficient way of repurposing landfill sites by, for example, use of renewables. We've looked at the Matra case in Hungary, for example, but also some areas, coal mines in Europe, where basically coal mine has closed down years and decades ago in the Netherlands, in Belgium, region of Genk, where it's still the process is there of how do we use the old buildings and infrastructure that is there. And I think my key message is try to think of ahead of time as soon as possible, because it is not a question of years, but it is a question of decades, really, where this whole transformation and repurposing process takes time. And the sooner we think, the better we have the post-mine use integrated in the mine planning already, the better it is. And there is actually a lot of opportunity going on. A lot of the sites, industrial sites, have good infrastructure connection, railways, cables, a lot of infrastructure that could be used, but it is often, there also sits liabilities in terms of waste, toxic waste, and other things that are related to industries, and getting rid of those, dealing with those liabilities and making it use for future businesses is really a big challenge. One issue is the final risk, and I'll spend a little bit more time on that. Next slide, please. Normally, it's financial risk is governed, and there are liability rules across the EU. But we see that with, on the one hand, liberalization of the energy market, and with the process of mines closing down earlier than some companies and governments would have anticipated some time ago, there of course is the risk that the companies may not be in a position to pay for mine rehabilitation as they were planning. And there is a risk that the liability basically gets shifted to the municipalities or the national government. And I think it's absolutely important to take precautionary measures so that it's not the region that basically has to pay for mine rehabilitation or sits on land and infrastructure it cannot use for future development. But it is important that there's a mechanism in place which is really future-proof. And we've looked at two mechanisms. One is a funding mechanism, and the other one is an institutional mechanism as a run-off company, which we describe in more detail. And we also picked international examples from Australia, one from Germany, the other, where this mechanism has been in place for quite some time. And I think it's inspirational to look at how have actually other regions used those mechanisms in the past, and what is it something regions that now face this process could think of. But here, of course, the point is you have to act quick, because if you want to implement a financial mechanism, then you have to do it at a time where the coal mining company is making money, is making profit. As soon as profits decline, then of course the risk increases of someone else having to pay for liabilities there. Next slide, please. As Brew mentioned, there have been a lot of support activities of the European Commission, and has been life projects, and one of those outcomes has been also tools that are used for other regions, and there is quite a lot of knowledge on how do we actually do mine closure process, how do we do environmental rehabilitation, repurposing of things. The problem just is that information sits with those regions who have already done it, right? The regions who are very far in that process, while those regions who have it ahead of them in the future, it's not as easy for them to get that information. So we have collected a set of knowledge and tools looking at how do you do closure processes, what is good institutional setups there. And often it's very much about information and transparency of information, knowing what is in the ground, really like physically GIS-based systems, or bringing together potential funders with a potential site and saying, okay, this is a site and this is what you can expect in this site, because if you want to invest it, if you want to build something new on that site, you need to know that, or you need, as an investor, you need to be certain that there is not risks buried in the ground that you will discover when you build something. So there is tools out, and I just invite you to have a look at the toolkit which we've developed, and explore the toolkit and go beyond the toolkit. As soon as you hit the links, you'll be directed to those tools. And with having said that, I'll close and hand over to Wolf. Next slide, please. Wolf Pohl is a specialist at World Bank. Andre has introduced him, and I think it just addresses this point of tools and knowledge and transparency. And Wolf, you'll be presenting, I call it a tool. I don't know if this is the term you prefer. I call it a tool which you're developing and using, and you've been, so to speak, testing it in Western Macedonia. And I'm looking forward to hear that Over to you, Wolf.
Okay, thank you very much, Timon, and thank you to the previous speakers. Without further ado, I would like to have the first slide of my presentation, please. So what do you see here? This is really a bit of a micro scale here. It was quite interesting to see sort of zooming in over the course of the presentations. Brü presented sort of the big policy strategy picture of the EU. Timon now presented a toolkit that includes various aspects, among them the actual technical tools. And this is now a little part of a technical tool that we developed and deployed in Western Macedonia on a lignite mining transition project. What you see here is basically a pixel matrix that is laid over a mining area, and then pixel by pixel, our tool investigates the land according to 5 categories, 5 properties: location and socio-economic dimensions, geotechnical stability, topography and hydrography, environmental risks and development opportunities, but also risks. So there's a cost factor as well in this model. And based on the combination of factors, scenarios are selected that are the most favorable for a particular pixel. In Western Macedonia, the various scenarios that we developed were things like forestry or natural habitats, agriculture, business parks, recreation, hotels, and things like that. And then finally, light industry, manufacturing, and energy production. So this model really is about matching land properties with the prevailing conditions, with the ideal model, the ideal repurposing model that matches the conditions. Maybe we can go to the next slide and zoom out a little bit again. This now is to demonstrate the application that we ran on the so-called Amintaio field of the Kozani lignite mining basin. It's quite interesting to see that on the left, you see a model that was generated by our tool. This took about a week for the consultant with whom we developed and tested the module. And on the right side, you see the model that was developed over months on a very iterative manner by PPC, the public power company, which is the owner and operator of the lignite mines. It's quite interesting that they show mostly good correlation. However, there are some deviations where PPC plans photovoltaics installed in areas that the model says are geotechnically unstable or risky, and where agriculture would be sort of the optimal option, where you have the least risk, we can use the land without much reconditioning, and you don't have to invest a lot of money in upgrading it for stabilities that support a higher value of use. Now, before I continue, let me zoom out a little further again, because this all sounds very, very detail obsessed. This is part of an advisory project that we're doing for the government of Greece. Actually, our client is the EU, the European Commission, that has 3 big pillars that come from the just transition strategy that the World Bank developed. One of the pillars is strategy and governance. Strategy meaning economic strategy and how to govern an economic transition in this area. The other is about people and communities, labor, re-employment, retraining, reskilling, etc. And the third finally is about land repurposing, land reclamation, and environmental issues. So just to give you the context, that this is not some little sort of tinkering hobby toolkit, but this is really an integral part of a much larger program. And how it is integral, I'd like to show you in the next slide. If we can have it, please. The next, yeah, thank you. So it's integrated in a thinking process that goes from a fairly linear model of reclamation to comply with an environmental permit towards a much more diverse and development-oriented use of the post-mining lands. Now, this is a different part of the Kozani Basin. This is the main field. Just for scale, in the larger graph on the left, the longer axis, the horizontal axis would be about 20 kilometers and the vertical about 15 kilometers. So this is a sizable chunk of land. We're talking about a good 100 square kilometers here that are going to be post-mining lands at one point. Now, the little graph on the lower right shows the current planning of PPC, which is really compliance driven. This is complying with the environmental permit under which they're operating. And you see basically three types of use. Green is forest, yellow is agriculture, blue is the residual ponds. What we now want to achieve is really to use Lura, to use this land use repurposing tool to generate and tickle out the opportunities that actually rest in this land. So to look at locations that could be very attractive for particular types of investments. There's already one example tucked away in some outer overburden dump is a waste recycling center that is far away from the next settlement, yet well connected to existing infrastructure because of all the nice haul roads in this mining area, that has energy supply and utilities, etc., etc. So this is one example of how these mining lands actually offer a spectrum of opportunities for redevelopment. Could I get the next slide, please? I hope I'm not offending anyone from Greece, but there's one thing that everyone who knows, everyone who has worked in Greece has been confronted with, and that is the permitting situation. It is not easy to get an environmental permit for an investment. So one idea that goes beyond the pure repurposing planning and goes towards application of this toolkit is to use it to generate a larger spatial plan, a spatial organization. In this case, again, you see on the right, in the larger graph, you see again the entire mining area that could be covered by what is called in Greece a special spatial plan. It's a bit of a tongue twister in English. So this special spatial plan would basically dedicate zones for specific types of uses, would be covered by a strategic environmental assessment and would be permitted under this strategic environmental assessment. So there would be a permit for the zones for a particular use, as you see in the graphic further left. Now, if an individual then comes and wants to invest in the zone, let's say the zone is for light industry, and a warehouse entrepreneur or light manufacturer wants to come in, he would not have to go through the environmental permitting process as a whole. He would basically come in and present his environmental management plan, including fire safety, wastewater, etc., for this particular plot of land. So this whole toolkit, combined with a more enabling regulatory regime, would really move the system towards a much more nimble and much more investor friendly climate that, especially in these core regions in transition, is extremely important to actually remove barriers, attract people, and unlock the value of the land. Next slide, please. Yeah, of course. Next, yeah, of course. There are not only advantages, but overall, I think the advantages of this proposed approach much outweigh the conventional approach that is really compliance driven and ends up in a very narrow scope of land use. Maybe I can arc back here for a moment to the polluter pays principle, because one question, of course, people might ask is, yeah, okay, you want to develop land, but what about the environmental permit? What about averting environmental risks from public health and safety? What about the agreements that have been made regarding cleanup in previous permits? That can all remain. It doesn't, redeveloping the land doesn't mean that you have to drop all the environmental agreements and environmental permits that have been made for it. It very often means simply going beyond these basic requirements and developing the value of the land in addition to taking care of the environmental and sometimes the geotechnical liabilities. Okay, next slide, please. We've looked at a couple of case studies, and the former GDR obviously presents a wide scope of fairly successful projects where such repurposing was done and where the permitting regime played a very crucial role in making this repurposing a success. This is an example from Saxony-Anhalt, the Chemiepark Bitterfeld, which was a horrendously and still is a horrendously polluted site, but with very, very skillful spatial planning, retaining heavily polluted sites as industrial areas, designing containment rather than cleanup measures, and creating a very enabling permitting regime. This is now again a chemistry park, or still a chemistry park, but one with very different looks than 50 or 30 years ago. I'll stop here. I would love to tell more. We are also engaged in China in a huge energy revolution project, they call it there, in the hard coal sector in the Shanxi province, where we are doing similar things. Again, I would like to emphasize that this toolkit is really part of a much larger transition approach that the bank offers to clients, and then follows up with financing instruments to actually help its implementation. Thank you very much. Sorry for a slight overtime.
Thanks very much to you, Wolf, and to Timon. If I can just encourage people to send questions our way. We have a couple, but you know, it's not a massive number, so please don't be shy. As I said, we try to answer as many as possible now. Those unanswered, we try to answer later, but it is also, you know, for us an indication of how interesting the webinar is for you. And as I said, we have 90 people, so I'm sure there are some good questions. Okay, but first of all, I have a question to Wolf directly in terms of, you know, you mentioned Western Macedonia, so that's lignite. How applicable is your tool to hard coal mining? You know, this is, I'm sure many of our attendees may be curious.
Well, it is applicable to basically any type of brownfield remediation. So it's not only applicable to mining, but the principles can be customized to any project where the redevelopment of land plays a major role. Of course, with lignite mining, you have the biggest demand of land, the biggest turnover of land. So lignite mining is churning through huge amounts of square kilometers, while in hard coal mining, things usually happen more underground. Still, above ground, you have plenty of phenomena. You have the subsidence, you have mine waste deposits, you have changed hydrographic regimes in many cases. So again, you have impacts that can be quite widespread over larger areas that would, of course, be integrated and assessed differently in this model. But overall, I think the mechanics of the model are really customizable to various conditions. The important thing is that they take into account not only environmental factors, not only geotechnical factors, but also things like location and socioeconomic, development opportunities, topography, etc. So we really try to bring into each pixel that we look at a wider range of perspectives, and must come to a land evaluation that is more comprehensive, and we believe then presents a more defensible picture and a more defensible approach to the really repurposing scenarios that we eventually help the client to develop. I hope that answers
Yeah, thank you very much. And there is one actually directly related question on the very tool, which is about availability of that tool as demo or link. You know, that people can kind of consult in their own time. Would you mention a word on that?
Well, the thing is, we are basically just about to deliver our outputs to the client. So this tool is really hot off the press. We don't have a demo version yet. It is really intended to be an open source tool. So what we will do over the next weeks is to allow people wider access and basically start tinkering and playing with the tool. So it's not going to be a secretive thing that is tucked away on some server. I have to apologize. It's just not available yet because we are still in the middle of putting our final deliverables together. Part of which is that tool. So this was really a very hot sneak preview you got here.
Okay, thank you very much. Then let me put a question, because while asking for your registration for the webinar, we also allowed you to formulate your questions or interests. So there's one question, and I think I would ask maybe Timon and perhaps Brieux as well to comment on that. I mean, the question was about coal regions are in many cases industrial regions on high risk of disappearing. How to protect the European industry against delocation? I think this touches upon this whole discussion about the infrastructure and you know, how the COVID rebuild and the Green Deal will work in practice to the benefit of the region, and sort of like new way of new industries and industrialization in the sort of green spirit. Would you be able to elaborate? Because I think this is a fascinating one.
Maybe I start out, and you can add. I mean, in the toolkit we've looked at. We started with a perspective of coal mines and coal regions, right? Which is basically the perspective of the platform, but. Very obviously, you come to very similar problems or similar issues and similar challenges with other industrial sites. And I mean, Wolf in his presentation showed the chemical park in Bitterfeld in Germany, which is not, well, there is a coal region close by, but the chemical park basically has very similar challenges as some of the industrial sites. What I find interesting is, I mean, there's more formal liability and yeah, making sure basically that there is that you deal with the land and the toxic waste and all the stuff for that. But I think there is more a business development side of it, which often is a question of creativity. And I found it interesting that in some regions there's processes going on where very early on, stakeholders got together and saying, okay, with a longer term perspective, we know that this power plant is going out of action and we need to do something with this power plant. But it's a good thing. It's an industrial site. We need land for industrial sites. There's infrastructure there. And to me, the best cases have been where different players like company, municipalities, regional businesses, and unions sit together and put their brains together to develop something. And actually, we've had some sessions in the past where, from the perspective of coal-fired power plant repurposing was addressed, but we see similar on, for example, steel industry and steel sites. But it is a challenge because you often need to bring new people together, and it's not all the companies that sit on the land have the strategic interest of developing it further, which is a difficult thing and which is not easy to address, especially because you do need some investments to go one step up. I don't know, what you would like to add on this issue.
Yeah, well, I would actually, you know, tackle the issue a bit differently, I guess, you know, from the perspective of the European Commission and having in mind the the recent developments related also to the COVID-19 crisis, which I think laid bare a bit this issue of we need to prevent the deindustrialization of Europe if we want the Europe to continue being a prosperous economy, because we cannot have such missing links in the value chains. It's important that we keep these jobs in Europe. It's not something that we didn't know before the coronavirus crisis, of course, but it definitely took another dimension when we were confronted, with interruptions in certain value chains, and this kind of things. So just to give you a few ideas of what is in the planning, let's say, to try to address this issue. Of course, it's an issue that not just the European Commission will address by itself. It's more of a joint effort by all the different parties active in Europe. But if you look at the recovery plan that Europe has, that the European Commission has proposed a week ago, there is two things that can be, perceived as designed for this specific purpose. On one side, you have a strategic investment facility that will really, make public investments in key strategic sectors, among which are identified key industrial sectors. So these are, this is one area. Another area is the just transition mechanism, actually, because it does not only tackle coal regions, but also these more carbon intensive industrial regions. And here, the role of the just transition mechanism for these specific industrial regions is to help them remain industrial regions. So it's a bit different, from coal regions, where we know the transition to something else is happening when we have a steel factory or a paper factory, which produces a lot of CO2. Our idea with the just transition mechanism is not to go to something else, but it's to help this industry decarbonize so that it can stay in Europe, it can stay competitive, and it can even, be at the edge of competitiveness around the world. Another element that I think has proved quite successful is the sort of industry initiatives that the EU has been promoting. So trying to put the private and the public sector together. You have the Battery Alliance, for instance. You have the Partnership on Low Carbon Steel. You'll have something on the hydrogen also coming up in the future. So really, this kind of key industrial value chains that we want to see prospering in the EU, we want to put a clear emphasis on them. So just, these are elements, they're pieces of the puzzle, so they're not necessarily there's no magic answer to fix this issue, which is complex. But just to tell you that there is a clear understanding of this issue at the European level, and that there is also a willingness to act to preserve the European industry and to make it cleaner, so that we can continue being an industrial continent in the future.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to report that there are questions flowing in our direction. So there is one that I find really interesting, and this actually links very well to the financing thing, the financing part. So I guess it will be for maybe Timon and Wolf. So the question is how to deal with ownership issues. So for instance, how to transform the owner of mining assets into developer or set up the special purpose vehicle. Is there any existing advice on that? Because I think this is really touches the core of what we want to really promote and achieve. Yeah. I don't know, Timon, if you want to start.
I can start in, and Wolf maybe can back that up with some more international expertise. But of course, that is an important issue. I think this specific setup, of course, needs to be checked from a country-specific perspective in terms of what are your national regulations to set up such a special company or a special vehicle. One case which I very briefly showed in my slide is is the RAG Foundation in Germany, which basically covers all the assets of the Ruhr mining area in Germany. And if you look at that, it's a huge area with many mines, very deep underground mines, and with long-term, like eternal obligations for water pumping. Basically, you have to forever. You have to pump up water, otherwise the whole Ruhr area would turn into a swamp. And that has been done by moving transferring the assets of the mine companies, or large parts of the assets of the mine companies, into a foundation. And that is not only the mines and the lands, but that is also part of the companies that have been developed under the mining companies, housing that have been built for people, for the miners, real estate, land, and so to speak. So there an institution has been created that really makes sure that long-term obligations can be met, but also some parts of the transition and new things can be developed. I found that a very interesting case, but as I said, you in detail, you of course have to check with the very specific setups and regulations of individual companies in individual countries. I don't know what your experiences is in this respect.
Nothing contrary to yours, Timo, but maybe I can add that the terms of reference for such a special purpose vehicle really are, they have to be case specific and tailored to the situation. Maybe quickly to the ownership. The ownership is usually not that much of a problem, because it's very often, the ownership of the lands is very often tied to the mining activity, and there is usually some sort of arrangement that the lands are returned to some previous ownership or brought into a fund or something of that sort. However, keeping the mine operator in the special purpose vehicle is of great importance and can have a lot of advantages, because that's where all the experience is, where the data are, where the technical staff is that can actually do this long aftercare that Timo was just referring to. However, an SPV should be a multi-stakeholder vehicle. It should be a vehicle where many people can hop onto and contribute. It can be quite noisy and quite difficult to maneuver it, but it's really important that you have various interests represented, because then it really becomes this effective instrument that can govern a transition process, representing multiple stakeholder interests and with a long-term vision and with multiple interests in mind. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. I would love to tell more about special purpose vehicles, because it's a really important and interesting instrument that bundles a lot of different responsibilities, skills, experience, and roles. But I'm afraid we are out of time at this point.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think we have time for one last question. And I think it's a very interesting one. So it's talking about the situation where you have some mines that will be closing and some mines that will still be operating because of the needs of the industries nearby. And the question is rehabilitation covering and those mines will need to be de-watered. So the question is rehabilitation covering the treatment of such water possible, and how is this managed and run? So the water related issues. I don't know who would like to, maybe Wolf, that's again more kind of your direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, a closed mine has to manage its liabilities, as Timo said, in perpetuity if necessary. In this case, it's managing liabilities through the groundwater rise and potential contaminated waters until the other mines also close and until an integrated water management concept can be designed. So I think it's very clearly the responsibility of the current mine owner of the mine that closes to make sure that that water management does not negatively impact neighbors. And the neighbors may be operating mines, maybe natural habitats, maybe water courses, maybe all sorts of other entities, but the important fact is the responsibility for maintaining safe water management as long as necessary is definitely with the mine operator. Of course, again, very often if you think in a more integrated manner, and if you think if you consolidate management efforts, there can be very often economies of scale. It can become cheaper. It can become easier. There can be logistical advantages. So we always encourage to look beyond the immediate legal or regulatory responsibilities and explore if beyond that there may be some opportunities to develop synergies or some sort of win-win situations. This is maybe a little more difficult for water management, but if we think rehabilitation and land management, I think there it becomes very obvious that if you lump together parcels of land to something of larger scale, you have a lot more degrees of freedom to actually manage it, develop it, and create value with it. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we still have a few questions which we'll answer offline, and some of them were relating to the LURA tool, to some technical economic feasibility, methane. There was a question that was already answered on the energy community, which is also doing work in that space. So we'll and the sort of practical applicability of the polluter pays principle. So we'll try to respond and engage with all of you. I think I'm afraid we are running out of time, so it's now time for a wrap up. I want to just say a big thank you for all of you who attended. We had nearly 100 people in the peak moment, and I think this is especially great that you wanted to carve out an hour of your time in the situation where basically the competition of online events is enormous in those times. This is the second online engagement of the platform. So as was announced already in May, we are still learning. So we'll listen to your comments and see if some changes are needed. I want to thank Martin, our colleague from the platform secretariat, for all his support on the sort of technology issues around the webinar. The presentations will be made available on DG Energy website. You just simply type in EU Call Regions events, and you can download the presentation. The video, as already mentioned, to be available on the DG Energy YouTube channel. We will send you an experience survey, and please fill this out, because we really listen to our community, and we'll make sure some of the implementable suggestions are really incorporated in the future webinars. What's next on the agenda? It was already announced, but just to put it again here, 18th of June, the third webinar on sustainable employment, and then 29th of June, 3rd of July, the virtual Coal Regions Week. We'll send you more details on participation and registration. And finally, I want to echo my colleague Robert, who facilitated the first webinar, and that is to say that it's really great that we are managing to stay connected and integrated in those times where physical meetings are not possible. And I think if we sustain this challenging time, integrated and engaged, then I hope whenever it's possible to meet again in Brussels, I'm sure the platform will be flourishing even more. So with that, big thanks to everyone, and have a lovely rest of the day, and see you shortly at our future events.